Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief update on all of our upcoming programs. If you're not yet a member of the Council Town Hall, please consider joining. It's a great way to continue to support the organization. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to bring on Dan Schnur, our own professor at Berkeley, UCLA, and USC, and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
Great. When I'm on one of your programs, it makes my week, I have to tell you.
Well, you're very nice. That's very kind of you.
Well, I know how hard you work on these topics, and you've got two big ones today, both sides of the spectrum. Why are Joe Biden's poll numbers falling so quickly? And is Donald Trump running for president again? So I'm going to give you all the time you need on these. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks to all of you for being with us. As always, we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us every Tuesday afternoon or evening. You know, these two topics, Biden and Trump, are perennials. And in fact, we could probably do these two topics or variations of them every week, all year for the next year and for the next 3 years, if not beyond. But it has been a while, even on a program entitled Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. It has been a while since we have talked about the leaders of each party in a political context. And so we thought it was about time, heading into some critical off-year elections, governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia, which we'll talk about next week, to take an assessment of the two parties' nominees from 2020 and get a sense for where they are a year later, or almost a year later, and where they may be a year or 3 years from now. So before we even get started, I'd like to begin with a question for all of you that's less about Joe Biden and more broadly about the role of government. So the question's pretty straightforward. Do you believe that government is trying to do too many things? Or alternatively, do you believe government should do more to solve problems? Option one is government's trying to do too many things. Option two is government should do more to solve our problems. And I'll tell you now, even before we get your answers, this is a question that the very highly respected Gallup polling company has asked American voters every year for almost 3 decades now. And so let's get a sense of where our group is on this broader philosophical question. Well, look at that. Very interesting. 3/4 of our group says government should do more to solve problems, 75%. And only 1/4 say the government's trying to do too many things. Well, we've known pretty much ever since we began these webinars that our audience, not completely, but largely existing in a fairly blue enclave of the greater Los Angeles area, we do know that our group leans somewhat to the left of the overall populace in the country. And on this question, that becomes particularly stark because while our group, as you just saw, said 75% to 25% government should do more, according to new data from Gallup out just last week, 54% of Americans think government is doing too many things that should be left to individuals and businesses. And only 43% said they wanted government to do more to solve the country's problems. Now, not only is that much different than our own group, but that's a major shift in public opinion from where we were just 1 year ago, October of 2020, when 54% said they wanted government to do more to solve the country's problems. And I'll tell you that 54% that said government should do more, that's an all-time high in Gallup polling over more than a quarter of a century. Now that reaction, atypical, was the result of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, and a general desire for the federal government to do whatever it could to get our country through the worst of the pandemic. Last year, in fact, was only the second time in Gallup's 29-year tracking of this specific question that at least half of Americans endorsed a more active role for government. The only other time going back 29 years that responses came in over 50% on that question was in the weeks after the September 11th terrorism attacks back in 2001, when we saw very high concern about terrorism and, not surprisingly, a corresponding surge in trust in government and interest in government to protect us from the potential of terrorist attacks. Otherwise, though, for about a quarter century now, Americans have generally said they'd prefer to see government do less and leave more to businesses and individuals. And fewer people would like to see government do more. That shift from last year, in 12 months, a double-digit shift, has very important political ramifications as well. Because if you come back to the present now, to October of 2021, when it looks like the virus is finally beginning to recede after the latest wave caused by the Delta variant, people are returning to their past desire to have government in their lives less rather than more. Now, much of that shift from 2020 to 2021 comes from independent voters. Last year, 56% of independents said they wanted government to do more to solve the problems facing the country. This year, just 38% of independents say the same. And that swing away from more government involvement, especially among independents, has to be a major concern for Joe Biden and his party as they first work to push through two very large pieces of government growing legislation in his infrastructure package and social spending and climate change reconciliation bill. And then second, of course, to seek to hold their House and Senate majorities next November in 2022. Now, remember that Biden ran as a centrist for the most part in 2020 against candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who were running on a much more ambitious progressive agenda. And after the election, when the poll numbers I was just talking about showed that most Americans were calling for a more expansive role for government, Biden shifted course from the way he'd been talking during the campaign to meet that moment. And the result wasn't just the bipartisan COVID relief package, but major legislation, as I was mentioning a moment ago, on infrastructure, on social services, on climate change, and on a number of other very, very ambitious proposals reflecting the mood of the public at the time that Biden was elected. But now, a year later, that attitude's starting to look somewhat more out of step with what the public is now saying about they want and don't want from their government. Now, there's no shortage of other challenges that Biden is facing. Since Republicans are not inclined to help him with any of his policy goals, he, Biden, is completely reliant on almost absolute Democratic unity to pass his policy priorities. And if anything, the divide between progressives and moderates in his party are not shrinking. If anything, they're getting deeper and wider. Voters have also judged him very harshly, according to public opinion polls, on the manner in which the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, even though voters supported the decision to withdraw itself. And of course, the fact that we're still dealing with COVID and a sluggish economy and inflation puts voters in a lousy mood, which is never a good thing for incumbents. But Biden's also being hurt by a growing perception among voters that the government experience on which he based his campaign, the competence on which he ran, isn't having the impact that they thought it would. Afghanistan's part of that, so is the immigration crisis. And on immigration, guns, voting reform, and several other liberal priorities, he's getting stuck between those on the right who oppose what he wants to do and those on the left who are mad at him because he hasn't gotten them done yet. But of course, that's life in a divided government. So what do you think? Question 2, if we can, Claire. Which of these is closest? Well, Claire, we ready for the second question? There we go. Which of these options is closest to your own feelings about the Biden presidency. His poll numbers are dropping, and we'll dig into those in just a minute. But let's see what our group thinks. Which of these options is closest to your own feelings? Number one, he's been a disappointment in office. Two, no, he's been doing an excellent job. Third, there's problems, but the blame ought to be on the Republicans for refusing to work with him. Fourth, yeah, everything's not going all that great, but the blame should be on the Democrats for not being able to unify behind him. Fifth, maybe things haven't been going all that well, but at least he isn't Trump. And I recognize that you might find more than one of those statements to be true, but we ask you to vote for the one that most closely mirrors your own sentiments, the one you feel most strongly about. So Claire, how did our group do? Very interesting. 34%, a little bit over a third, but these are really split numbers. Only 4%, even of our fairly blue group, say that Biden's been doing an excellent job. 34%, just over a third, say there's problems, but it's the Republicans' fault. Another 32%, roughly a third, say, well, things haven't been going all that well, but we'll settle for him at least because he's not Trump. And then smaller numbers, 16% blame the Democrats for not unifying behind the Biden agenda. And 14% say more broadly they feel like he's been a disappointment. But only 4% of our group think he's doing an excellent job. And based on the disparity of poll numbers we saw in answer to our first question, that of course doesn't bode all that well for his numbers across the country. Now, the other challenge for Biden is that this ongoing debate over his two big legislative goals, infrastructure and the social services and climate change reconciliation bill, take up a lot of time. So Biden hasn't been able to devote as much time or public attention to the many other issues on which his supporters want to see action and are becoming increasingly impatient. Now, again, this is the problem that comes with such small congressional majorities. It's said that Biden is trying to be Franklin Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson, but both of those presidents had huge margins of majority support in Congress. Biden doesn't have that luxury. And while the delays may be the fault of others on the right or on the left, one of the abiding principles of politics is that the person in charge gets way too much credit, gets much more credit than they deserve when things are good, and way too much blame when they're bad. So let's dig into the poll numbers now, because you add up all these factors and what you're left with is some fairly underwhelming results. The latest Quinnipiac national poll has Biden underwater by 11 percentage points among registered voters, and that means 11% more people disapprove of Biden than approve. He now has a 40% approval rating among registered voters and a 51% disapproval among registered voters. Just a month ago, this same poll, Quinnipiac, had Biden down 6 points, now 11 points. So his standing nationally is deteriorating fairly quickly. Now get this, we heard the numbers on independents earlier when we asked about their attitudes toward government. Independents, who I would argue, powered Biden to the presidency, disapprove of Biden by a whopping 28 points. Only 28% of Americans who call themselves independents, a little bit more than 1/4, only 28% of independents approve of the Biden presidency. 56% disapprove. So a 2-to-1 margin of opposition. Now, Congress doesn't escape blame either. 60% of Americans disapprove of Democrats in Congress. 65% of Americans disapprove of Republicans in Congress. And while this comes from a lot of different places, what's really driving it more than anything else, as we talked about earlier, is the continued presence and the continued menace of the coronavirus. Let me share some numbers from another recent poll, this one done by Axios, specifically on COVID. So back in June, this survey showed that 36% of US adults said that they expected to get back to their normal pre-COVID life at some point in the next 6 months. So back in June, 36%, a little bit more than 1 out of 3 Americans said, hey, in 6 months we'll be back to normal. Today, that share is just 13%. Only 13% of Americans, roughly 1 out of every 8, think we'll be back to normal in 6 months. Those expecting it to take more than a year for us to be back to normal has tripled since June. Back in June, only 9% said it would take a year or more. Now 30% say that. Back in June, about 65% of people who thought life would be normal again in 6 months also said they trusted Biden a great deal or a fair amount. Today, just 44% of those who think life will be normal again in 6 months say that they trust Biden. And most Democrats say they still have some degree of trust in the president to provide them accurate information on COVID, but that trust those levels are a lot less than they used to be. 81% of Democrats now say they've got at least a fair amount of trust in Biden. That's down from 88% over the summer. And the share of Democrats who say they have a great deal of trust in Biden has dropped from 45% to 33%. And those falling numbers among Democrats affect Biden not just on COVID, but on other issues too. Because logically speaking, when you don't trust someone on a matter, you're less likely to trust them on others. So Claire, let's ask our group another question now if we can. Let's go to our question. What do you think? What will be the most important issue on which you will judge Biden? You've already told us your feelings earlier, but let's break it down a little bit more specifically. What issue more than any other is going to lead you to conclude that Biden is doing a good or a bad job? Is it COVID? Is it the economy, jobs, taxes, and so forth? Is it social services, healthcare, and education and related spending, related programs? Is it climate change? Or is it immigration? And I know for some of you it might be another issue, but we only get 5 options on this program. So let's see what you think about these. What's about these 5? Wow, that is interesting. 41% of you say that the economy and related issues is the most important issue on which you'll judge Biden. Another 18% say COVID. And I think we could argue that the economy to a large degree is given by a recovery from the pandemic. So those two numbers add up to almost 60%. Then less than that, 18% say health, social services, 15% say climate change, and 8% say immigration. And so let's go right to the next question now, if we can, Claire. Now that you've just talked about which issue you think is most important to you when it comes to judging Biden, simply quick, straightforward yes or no question here. On that issue, whatever you just named in the last question, is he, Biden, doing enough on that issue to satisfy you? Yes or no, up or down? What do you think? Now, look at those numbers too. Again, for a group that does tend to lean somewhat left, 58% say that Biden is not doing a satisfactory job on the issue that's most important to you. Only 42% say that he is. Now, the talk in Washington is that Biden needs to get those 2 big bills passed by the end of October. But those are mostly internal working deadlines. It's worth assuming, actually, that the infrastructure and reconciliation bills are probably going to take up most of the rest of the year, till sometime in December, close to the holidays. And that creates 2 additional problems for Biden. First, it means there's not much time for any of his other policy goals, whether it's voting rights, whether it's immigration, guns, climate change. These other 2 bills are going to take up most of the bandwidth that he and Congress will have between now and the end of the year, I think, which means a lot of those other things don't get addressed. And of course, once the election year is underway in January of 22, not much else is going to get done with the elections coming up. But what it also means is that these 2 bills, the infrastructure and the social spending bill, these 2 pieces of legislation are an immense political gamble for Biden. Both Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, when they passed their expansive legislative packages back in their days, the New Deal and the Great Society, both Roosevelt and Johnson divided up their agendas into many different smaller pieces of legislation. Some of those bills passed and some of them didn't. But what that meant is that even though FDR and LBJ didn't get everything they wanted, meant they achieved some legislative victories with Congress, and with it came some momentum and growing support. These two very large, expansive bills for Biden are really an all or nothing bet. And for his party's prospects next November, they are too big to fail. So we'll know a lot more 2 weeks from now, once we get to that end of the month current deadline. But I'd be very surprised if this discussion, if these pieces of legislation are finished up by then, one way or the other. So let's move on. Let's move on to topic number 2. We talked about Biden. Now let's talk about Donald Trump. Topic number 2, what is Donald Trump doing? So I'm going to offer you a clue from a trip that Trump recently made, not to Florida, not to Mar-a-Lago, not to his other country club in New Jersey. But as I think you know, Trump has begun doing rallies with conservative supporters around the country. And just a week or so ago, he took a trip to Iowa. Now, we all know that in presidential election years, the story always starts in Iowa. But even though we're currently in 2021, not 2024, Iowa is still a pretty good place to look if we want to understand what's going on inside the Republican Party. So a couple weeks ago, the state Republican Party there held its annual convention. And I would tell you that under most circumstances, a Republican Party rally in Des Moines, Iowa, more than 3 years before the next presidential caucuses, would have attracted pretty little attention. But when Donald Trump comes to town, the rules change. And Trump's appearance there before a crowd of thousands of conservative supporters provide us with some very helpful clues about where the Republican Party might be headed between now and next November. Now, the fact that Trump attracted such a large and enthusiastic turnout of activists shouldn't have been surprising. But what was notable is that longtime Republican Senator Charles Grassley, who was first elected to the office of Senate on the same ballot that first brought Ronald Reagan to the White House more than 40 years ago, and who had harshly criticized Trump for Trump's conduct after the January 6th Capitol riots, Grassley was on stage with Trump for the rally. And the reason for that is because Trump used the event to very emphatically and strongly urge his supporters to support Grassley's 2022 reelection campaign. Now think about this. Grassley was elected to the Senate in 1980. He took office in 1981. He's 88 years old. He will be running for his 8th term in the Senate. His age, his tenure in office, his biography make him the epitome of an establishment politician and the antithesis of a Trump-era Republican who, as I said earlier, was very critical of the president, the now former president, after the January 6th riots. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a quote from Senator Grassley when he was asked after the rally about Trump's support, given Grassley's past criticisms of Trump. Grassley said this. He said, quote, "I was born at night, but not last night. So if I didn't accept the endorsement of a person that's got 91% of the Republican voters in Iowa, I wouldn't be too smart. I'm smart enough to accept that endorsement." Then Grassley said this about Trump, quote, "He's a private citizen. He can say anything he wants to," unquote. So let's agree that Senator Charles Grassley did not sound all that excited about Donald Trump's endorsement, but he understood that it was necessary. In the logical conclusion, both from Trump's endorsement and Grassley's reaction to it, is that both of them need the other one a lot more than either one of them would like to admit. Recent polling shows Grassley has a very sizable lead over his likely Democratic challenger next year, and Grassley is viewed favorably by 81% of Iowa Republicans. But Trump's even more popular, and even in a conservative state like Iowa, an institution like Grassley knows enough to avoid a conflict with the former president. I'd offer you this. If a traditional old school pre-20th century conservative like Grassley, seemingly safe in his own reelection campaign, feels compelled to embrace Trump to ensure his survival and to not have to deal with a Trump favored primary opponent, then my guess is a lot of other old school Republicans are going to believe that they need to do the same thing in their own campaigns next year and in 2024. And that means that large majorities of the Republican Party's elected leadership are going to swallow their tongues when Trump starts talking about the voter fraud that he believes cost him last year's election. In the last week or so, Trump is complicating matters for other Republicans even further. He's begun saying that Republicans who don't support his calls for further investigations will likely suffer from lower voter turnout among conservatives in their own races. He's saying, if you don't support me on this voter fraud stuff, my voters aren't going to turn out for you. Now, Trump's advisors say that Trump's just making a prediction about what might happen if the base isn't enthusiastic. But a lot of other Republicans say that that sounds like a threat, and that if a candidate doesn't join Trump in calling for voter fraud investigations, that Trump, could very easily end up telling his supporters to stay home and cost those Republican candidates their election campaigns. So on one hand, Trump undeniably motivates the Republican base. On the other, he creates all sorts of challenges for Republican candidates who need to reach out to swing voters in the political center. Maybe not Charles Grassley in a conservative state like Iowa, but in other swing states and competitive House districts around the country, the dynamic is much different. So Claire, let's put up our next question for our group here and ask them to give us an assessment on sort of the twin challenges that Trump presents for Republican candidates. What do you think will be Trump's main impact next year in 2022 in the midterm elections? Do you think his main impact will be to motivate the Republican base? Do you think he'll be able to help persuade undecided voters? Will his main impact be to motivate the Democratic base? Voters who are angry about him, who see him on the campaign trail and want to punish the candidates he supports rather than reward them. Or fourth, does he push undecided voters in the other direction rather than bring them toward his candidates? Which of the four do you think? Trump, to some degree, is going to have all four of those impacts, but which do you think will be the most pronounced one? Wow, look at that. Even for a group that tends to lean fairly leftward, it's very instructive to see that 58% of you think that his main impact will be motivating the Republican base. 29%, exactly half of that, say he'll motivate Democrats. So by a 2-to-1 margin, you think his motivational impact will be more on Republicans than Democrats. And it appears that very few of you feel he's going to have much of an impact with swing voters, one way or the other. So as the 2024 presidential campaign draws closer, vocal Republican skeptics of Trump, like Mitt Romney and Lynn Cheney, based on the dynamic we've been talking about, are probably going to become even more isolated in the party. In other words, if Republican candidates feel pressured to support Trump and to support his claims for voter fraud, those naysayers like Romney and Cheney are going to become much smaller in number and much more marginalized in the party. Now in 2024, Cheney might run for president. So might another Trump skeptic like Ben Sasse, the senator from Nebraska. But if Trump runs for re-election, either he or one of his imitators, if he doesn't, begins that presidential campaign 3 years from now with a decided advantage. Now, it's impossible to predict whether Trump is going to run again. But either way, the intra-party divide between his supporters and his detractors will define the 2022 and 2024 elections. And the fact that a Reagan-era Republican like Charles Grassley lines up with Trump speaks volumes about where GOP activists and elected officials are going to be when that fight gets underway. So we've spent a lot of time over the months talking about the division within the Democratic Party between moderates and progressives. And as the debate over the infrastructure and reconciliation bills continue, we'll get back to that. But it's worth remembering that the divides in both parties are pretty extreme. And ironically enough, both of those internal divisions are probably the greatest obstacle to their respective parties' success in 2022. So just to wrap this up before we bring on Jessica and go to the questions, I'd like to ask you one more question if I can from our polling master, Claire. Thank you. Given what we've talked about and given what you've thought about, what you've been reading about and reflecting on, which party do you think will control Congress after the midterm elections next year? Will the Democrats maintain control over both houses of Congress, both the House and the Senate? Will Republicans win back both? Or will there be a split result? Will the Democrats hold the Senate and Republicans take the House? Or alternatively, will Republicans take control of the Senate, but the Democrats hold the House? How did we do on this one, Claire? What did our group think? Look at that. 47%, almost half of our group, thinks that Republicans are going to control both the House and the Senate next year. Only 15% say Democrats will maintain their majorities. That's a 3-to-1 margin in favor of the Republicans. 24% see a Republican Senate and Democratic House. 14% say Democratic House and Democratic Senate and Republican House. Add that up, that's a little bit less than 40%. But to me, the most instructive is by a 3-to-1 margin. Our group thinks that Republicans will begin 2023, the presidential election cycle, in which Joe Biden faces re-election against either Donald Trump or another Republican. By a 3-to-1 margin, our group think that Republicans will have congressional majorities by then, not the Democrats. So what that means, among many other things, is that the impetus for Biden to pass his legislative package this year is even more important. Because if bills of that magnitude often don't pass during election years, and if Republicans do take Congress back in the midterm elections, these next several weeks are the window of opportunity for a whole range of progressive policy priorities. So next week, when we go back to talking about the negotiations and divisions within the Democratic Party, let's keep in mind how high the stakes are and how quickly the window might close on this window of opportunity for the president and his party. All right, Jessica, if you care to join me, we'd love to have you. There she is.
Hey.
And how are we doing on questions? How's it looking?
We're doing good. Let's jump right in here. The first question, how can Biden address the recalcitrant Democrats? The party should unify.
How can Biden bring the party together? And that is the literally multi-trillion-dollar question circulating around Washington. My own opinion on this, and this is going to sound like harsher criticism of the president than I intend, is the best way to bring together warring factions is to lead. And I understand and I respect that Joe Biden has spent many years in Washington and has established a deserved reputation as a very talented negotiator in Congress. And over the last several months, he's devoted an extraordinary amount of time to meeting with progressives and moderates in his party, trying to find out where they're willing to compromise and where they're not. What Biden hasn't done, at least not yet, is plant his flag and say, here is the package that I want, not just the number, but the nature and the content of the two bills, and say to Bernie Sanders and to Joe Manchin, say to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and to Kyrsten Sinema, this is the bottom line. I've gotten you a great deal of what you want. I can't get you all of what you want in a 50-50 Senate and a 3-seat majority House, but this is where I take my stand. And you can either stand with me and help me pass these seminal pieces of legislation, increase our chances of maintaining and increasing our House majorities, and passing into law many, if not all, of the Democratic Party's overriding policy goals. Or you can step aside and you can let it fail. We will accomplish little legislatively. And next year, when the Republicans take over Congress, our window of opportunity will have closed, maybe for 2 years, maybe for 4 years, maybe for more. But I think ultimately putting both factions on the spot and saying, I want you to stand up before the country and your party and your supporters and say, I'm willing to let this president fail. I suspect that with that kind of approach, he's more likely to get the kind of outcome he wants than the ongoing shuttle diplomacy with which the president and the White House are currently engaged. That's not to say that what he's done up until now has been wrong. I think it's important to make all the stakeholders feel like they have a vested interest in the process and in the outcome. And if and when he does plant his flag, he'll be able to credibly point to both sides and say, look at how hard I worked with you. Look at how much I got you. But I think now is the time for him to say, all right, enough's enough. You're either with me or you go home and explain to your voters why you forfeited our greatest opportunity in years, if not decades.
Thank you. Since Biden's ability to succeed in the areas of the economy, jobs, and taxes is in large part dependent on the COVID situation, what is it about Biden's COVID policy that is losing him support? Too lax, too strict about mandates, or just too confusing overall?
Unfortunately, and somewhat unfairly, I think it's the latter. Generally speaking, the American people tend to be much more supportive of Biden's approach on the pandemic, masks, vaccines, mandates, and so on, than they were of Trump's or than they are of some of the leading Republican governors around the country. But there has been a lack of clarity and a relatively high level of confusion from a president and administration that take such pride in competence and experience. People are frustrated. As you heard in those poll numbers that I read, back in June, people thought they were seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Now they're much more negative about it. And as you heard me say, whether it's fair or not, when times are good, the person in charge gets too much credit. And when things are bad, they get too much blame. So this has been a drag. And some of it is for reasons beyond Biden's control. But I do think that the administration's messaging on many of these items, particularly as it relates to vaccines, has been somewhat confusing for a lot of people. And while I don't think that he would be enjoying very high poll numbers, regardless of how well or poorly they've been handling this, if the virus was still with us, I think to some degree the administration has hurt themselves by not delivering a more clear and an easier to understand message.
If the Democrats can unite and pass both bills before Congress, do all the poll numbers you discussed go out the window?
I don't know if all of these poll numbers go out the window, but there's an old saying, nothing succeeds like success. So I do believe that if Biden can, by the end of the year, not only go to his own supporters and say, hey, look what we did together, but go to that vast number of independents and swing voters who are souring on him and say, it wasn't pretty, but look at what we're going to be able to provide for you and your families, the family leave, the child care, the other items that he's prioritizing. I suspect that both the president and his party will get a very healthy boost in the polls when those pieces of legislation are signed into law. Now, with that prediction comes a caveat. If you look back through history, the electoral impact of significant policy achievements often takes more than a year to kick in. And so even a bill that passes this November or December might not have as much impact in next midterm elections as Biden and his fellow Democrats would like. But I do believe that his and their poll numbers will improve to a great degree, both by motivating the Democratic base and bringing back enough of those independents to make next year's midterm elections more competitive and perhaps give them some advantage going into those votes.
Even if the GOP takes Congress back, what changes in terms of getting anything done? They will still block all of Biden's initiatives as they are doing now. If they control Congress, what will they get done? More conservative judges?
Well, number one, of course, a Republican. There's a number of places where a Republican Congress would make an immense change for the better or worse, given your own politics. For example, depending on your feelings about the investigation into the January 6th riots, under a Democratic Congress, those would almost certainly continue in 2023. Under a Republican Congress, they would almost certainly come to an end. And while the prospect for broad legislative and policy change is not large under a Democratic Congress, it's plausible. It's possible. Under a Republican Congress, it's almost impossible to see how Biden would achieve any policy goals at all. Even though the gridlock in Washington now seems intractable, there's at least a potential for Biden and his allies to forge a way forward. With a Republican Congress and a Democratic president, that all disappears. So you might not see it as an immense change, but think of it as a shift from a slight opportunity for progress to no opportunity for progress whatsoever. Or alternatively, if you're a Republican, you'll see it as good news because there's still a slight opportunity for policy change that you think might be damaging, whereas under Republican Congress, there would be none.
Thank you. Did Biden make a tactical mistake by not insisting the House pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill? And is McCarthy making a mistake by not providing enough Republican votes?
I think both are making mistakes. I understand why Biden didn't force the House on the infrastructure bill, because he was concerned it would lose without the larger social spending and climate change reconciliation legislation. But I also think that if the bill had gone to the floor and Biden had gone to the Progressive Caucus and made the kind of statement that I talked about earlier, saying, I know this isn't everything you want, but between reconciliation, between infrastructure, and between the original COVID bill, we'll have spent over $5 trillion in investment in our future. It might not be everything the Progressive Caucus wants, but it's a major, major step forward. I think if he were to have planted the flag on it, he would have gotten the votes. So I think by holding back further, he's increased the risk. That doesn't mean that he can't go back now and deliver that statement, as I suggested earlier. But I feel like if he had done it then, he would have been able to call the bluff on enough House progressives to get the bill through. Of course, his legislative advisors work on this all day, every day. They do nothing but talk to those House members, and I don't. So it's easy for me to say from the cheap seats that I know that those votes would be there when the very smart and experienced people around the president came to a different conclusion. But I do think that at a certain point, presidential leadership, whether under a Democrat or a Republican, does require taking that stand and planting that flag and saying, you're either going to stand with me or you're going to explain to your constituents why you kept us from accomplishing the goals on which you campaigned. I understand McCarthy's thinking too, although I disagree with it. McCarthy feels that allowing some Republicans to vote for this, even if it were to help their own reelection chances, also helps Biden and also increases the likelihood of Democrats keeping their majorities. What McCarthy is essentially doing is saying, I recognize that I'm putting some of my more vulnerable House members at risk, but that's a trade-off next year, but that's a trade-off I'm willing to make in order to have voters that angry and upset with Washington for not getting anything done. I think in a previous political era, it would have been easier for Biden to go to his progressives with the kind of statement that I talked about. And in a previous political era, it would have been much more likely that McCarthy would have gone to his own more centrist members with a permission slip, if you will, to cast the vote. But as we've talked about many times on this webinar in the last year and a half, I came up in a different political era than the one that currently exists. And the political area in which I came up, in which those kind of maneuvers would have been more likely, doesn't exist anymore. Could McCarthy and Biden making a different decision have allowed that type of era to begin to restore? Perhaps, but I don't think we'll have the chance to know.
So far this evening, you've discussed 3 politicians who are well beyond of what would be considered working age. What can be done to attract younger candidates to run for office during such divisive times?
Boy, it's a terrific question. And for those of you who didn't see it, Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, a Republican but somewhat of a maverick, earlier this week suggested senility tests for all elected officials of both parties over a certain age. And he hastened to say that he was not targeting this at any elected official, Democrat or Republican, but certainly acknowledging that as time passed and as many get up in years, their mental capabilities diminish to some degree. So that was Cassidy's very unique way of calling attention to what many are calling a gerontocracy of a disproportionate number of older Americans overseeing our political and governance systems. So what can be done to encourage more young people to run for office? There's a longer conversation than we have time for today about campaign finance reform and making it easier for a younger person who hasn't had a lifetime to build up political chits or a donor network to run for office. But I also think, and this is a longer conversation for another day too, Jessica, that perhaps we can get back to, is at the risk of sounding a little bit too pie in the sky and roomy-eyed, I think a bit more civility in Congress or in politics would convince good people of both parties to more likely seriously consider running. More and more of my students, both Democrat and Republican and other, who have a calling toward civic engagement in public service, more and more of them are looking for other ways to engage and make a difference other than running for office, simply because they see the process of running and serving is such an unpleasant one. Regardless of whether you happen to come down on the side of the progressives or the moderates in the internal Senate debate, I think the spectacle of activists following Senator Kyrsten Sinema to the restroom during her visit to Arizona State University a couple weeks ago is an absolutely intolerable sign of disrespect for not just an elected official, but for another human being. I think the number of elected officials of both parties who find protesters not only camping outside their offices, but protesting outside their private homes, frightening their children, bothering their neighbors, causing untoward amounts of property damage. Well, that can be a very discouraging thing for a civic-minded young person. Think, if I run for office, do I want to have to deal with that? I think if there is a way to remember that even someone who votes that you consider to be the wrong way on an important piece of legislation is someone who still deserves to be protested and argued with during work hours, but ought to be able to go home at the end of the day and enjoy their family the same way that you do. So there is a campaign finance reform argument to be made, but more broadly, I think there's a civility in politics discussion that is long overdue. And if we can make the political system even somewhat more collegial, I think you're much more likely to see that really smart, really determined, really committed young person, instead of going to work for a nonprofit or an NGO or a community organization, to decide to run for elective office themselves.
Many businesses today have help wanted signs. Where are the workers going to come from to fulfill the infrastructure bill?
Well, if the infrastructure bill does pass, it will require an immense amount of new hires. And that's one of the selling points of the bill, that it'll create jobs. I think one of the things we've learned over the last several months as people return to work after the worst of the pandemic is that they're willing to return to work, but only under certain circumstances. And that means that those infrastructure jobs will need to pay better. We will need to see higher wages, better protections for workers, and other amenities for workers that haven't always been the case in the past. So what we see as the American workers rather slowly begin to return to the workplace is, if you make it worth their while, they'll come back. And so, as we're already seeing in the service industry, as we're already seeing in retail, as we're already seeing in the restaurant and hotel industry, we need to pay these workers more money and offer them other types of support in order to convince them it's worth coming back. But the infrastructure bill, as I understand it, does not support a large number of minimum wage or close to minimum wage jobs, but most of those jobs in construction, in manufacturing, do pay more and offer some of the other benefits that are more likely to bring people back to the workplace. So It's certainly going to be a challenge, but I think the resources are there if the bill does pass to attract individuals who haven't been working, if this is worth their return to employment.
Pivoting to your second topic, when did Donald Trump stop running for president?
Well, that's a fair question. And of course, we have no idea whether he's running in 2024. And as you've heard me say any number of times over the last year and a half, I stopped making predictions about Donald Trump in early November 2016. So I don't know if he's running again in 2024. I don't think he knows whether he's running again in 2024. But what the questioner points out, I think correctly, is that what Trump has been doing ever since the 2020 election is doing everything to not only leave his options open should he decide to run, but doing everything he can to maximize the likelihood that if he did run, he would win both the Republican nomination and a general election. So I don't know if he's running, but he's not just keeping his options open. He's doing everything he can to make sure that if he does run, his chances of winning are as large as possible.
Thank you. What is Trump's hold on the conservatives?
What is Trump's hold on the conservatives? Well, there's been no shortage of public opinion polling done over the years that showed that not all conservatives necessarily agree with Trump on all the issues. And while there are some in which Trump has very adroitly tapped into a cultural resentment that's manifested itself on any number of public policy matters, on trade, on US foreign military engagement, these are issues that he's used to his benefit. But for the most part, I believe that from the very beginning back in 2015, Trump's greatest affinity to those disaffected conservative voters is less a matter of specific policy and more attitudinal. From the very beginning, Trump has said, you, the voters to whom he is speaking, the voters to whom he is targeting, he said, you've been ignored by the politicians from both parties, Republicans and Democrats, for way too long. I'm not going to ignore you. I got your back. And whether it's on trade issues, whether it's on other issues of concern to the economic working class, Trump has been able to very successfully frame an us versus them argument. Now, in some ways, it's not all that different than the argument that Bernie Sanders has used so effectively to marshal his progressive supporters. In both cases, both men, both populist leaders say to their followers, the rest of those politicians, those elites, those establishments don't pay attention to you. Not me. I'm paying attention to you, I'm listening to you, and I'm fighting for you. And in both cases, they attract a very, very fervent following. I don't mean to suggest that the policy specifics aren't important. Of course they are. And particularly with social and cultural conservatives, Trump has been able to motivate these voters to a very large degree. But I think a lot of it is channeling voter anger and frustration toward business as usual and politics as usual, and positioning himself on the side of those disaffected in a way that makes them feel like he's fighting on their behalf.
Thank you. Has Biden surrounded himself with moderates or progressives? Has that been a positive or negative for his policy?
Biden has both around him. His innermost circle, those 4, 5, 6 people in the White House who are closest to him, tend to be more centrist, but they're probably more pragmatist and establishment than they are ideologues either on the center or on the left. More broadly, though, if you look throughout his administration, it's a pretty even ideological distribution, an ideological balance between progressives and moderates. And that's what you do want in a leadership team. But at a certain point, even while you want to make sure that every voice is heard and every faction is heard from, at a certain point, the person in charge has to make the decision and say to disappointed progressives or disappointed moderates, or in a Republican administration, perhaps disappointed conservatives, say, I have you here because I want to hear your voice, but that doesn't mean that I'm always going to agree with you. And once again, going back to the conversation we had earlier in our session, Jessica, it's time, if not past time, for Biden to deliver that message, not just externally, but internally to his own team.
Thank you. We got a lot of questions about the January 6th committee, so I'll try to kind of sum them up. Do you think if Trump is forced to testify in the January 6th insurrection or is successfully sued, will it impact Trump's power hold over his base?
I don't, at least not to a large degree, but it doesn't mean it's not important for the hearings to proceed, and if possible, for Trump to participate in them. Not because his own supporters are going to turn around and vote for the Democratic candidate for president, but it's entirely possible that if the January 6th hearings go in a particularly unfavorable way for the president, his supporters aren't going to switch sides, or perhaps but more likely to simply become less enthusiastic. Trump clearly does not want to testify. He's invoking executive privilege in an unprecedented way for a former president, as are his former staff and advisors. If they thought that this was something that could have a motivational impact on his own base, they wouldn't be fighting against it so hard. And once again, going back to the fight for the control of Congress, regardless of whether you think there'll be any policy differences or not under a Republican Congress versus a Democratic Congress, and I think there may be, maybe not probably, but at least possibly, the most important difference is that if Republicans do win back Congress, then that will be the end of the January 6th hearings. And regardless of whether you happen to think that that's a good or a bad thing, Trump at this point, it appears to me, is resisting in an effort not to win his lawsuits, but to play for time. Because if he can drag this out through this time next year or a few weeks beyond, he knows that if Republicans do win back congressional majorities in 2022, then the January 6th hearings won't conclude. Again, each individual decides for themselves whether that's a desirable outcome or not. But to me, it is the greatest likely differentiator, depending on the outcome of next year's midterm elections.
Thank you. This next questioner asks, does Dan see any positive signs about America?
Do I see any positive signs about America? Oh my gosh, of course I do. And I know when we get down deep in the weeds in these conversations, it can seem pretty dour, but I am extraordinarily optimistic. And at 5:57, I don't think I have the window of opportunity to explain in great detail why I'm so optimistic. But the very brief version is, number one, while democracy was threatened this past January, democracy held. And while both major parties are very bitterly divided, I see really good, really admirable people in both parties, in both factions within both parties, who under the right circumstances can and would do the right thing. I'm optimistic because I get to spend almost every day with the most incredible young people in the country, these really smart, determined, committed individuals who are just so excited and so eager to make change in some way or the other. And I get to talk to them about politics and communications and leadership. And whether they do it in elective office or another way, I think they're going to do incredible things once they move from being our future leaders to our leaders. And as many of you have heard me say many times before, I look back at John Meacham's wonderful book, The Soul of America, for examples throughout our nation's history about how we have faced past challenges like this one, very bitter divisions, very ugly hatreds and resentments, and how we've gotten past them in each of those circumstances. So again, when we get down into the weeds of particular pieces of legislation and polling information, it can sound really dire, and I can sound pretty dour. So I really want to thank that questioner for reminding me to remind you that just because there's all sorts of challenges ahead doesn't mean that there isn't a light at the end of the tunnel. And perhaps, Jessica, it's a good reminder for us, for you and me, that we need to devote a little bit more time as we plan these sessions each week, a little bit more time talking about the light and a little bit less time talking about the tunnel.
That sounds good to me. I think that's a good place to end this conversation since we're at the end of the hour. So to our audience, thank you for all your great questions. And Dan, thanks again for a great discussion. We look forward to seeing you next week. And for those of you that are joining us for the after session, for our members only, I will see you in just a couple of minutes. Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Great job. Dan, that was a great way to finish today's program. We have to bring John Meacham on with you and have a great talk about the soul of America. We'll put that on our to-do list.
That's a great idea.
Dan, why don't you stick with me while I just quickly wrap up and
Yes.
share some of our upcoming programs. This Thursday, we have a very special guest with Roger McNamee, who will be addressing social media's dark side. So don't miss that. He was an early investor in Facebook, and he has a lot to share. Next week, of course, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with Dan Schnur at 5 p.m. on Tuesday. On the 27th of October, we have U.S. Senator Todd Young, who's on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's going to be talking about competition with China. And on November 1st, Peter Martin, who is a Bloomberg journalist who specializes in China security, will be speaking about China's civilian army, the making of wolf warriors diplomacy. So please go to our website, lawacth.org. Register today. You can also see all of Dan's past programs and all of our programs. They're all free on the website. You can become a member, make a donation. We so appreciate your support. So hope to see you all Thursday. Take care.
Thanks so much, everybody.